Um, Here's what I so desperately want for you and for me today is that we could have a moment of clarity, like in a life that can get so clouded by so many distractions, like just like lighthearted distractions, like whatever TV show we're binge watching right now that takes our mind away from the moment, or whatever social media post or thing, news story that we're following, like things like that can just like distract us from being present in the moment, to like really deep-rooted things like wounds that we've received, being neglected or abused by our parents or one of our parents or a sibling or a family member, or those deep-rooted things that make it really hard to be present in the moment and not defined by those things that have been done to us, that we could have a moment of clarity to find ourselves sort of like at the center of a target, understanding that all those things are there surrounding us, and all those things are calling to us, trying to get us to look away from the center of the target that is the unadorned us, the us of us, the us that was created by God, that's not defined by the good things that we do or the bad things that we do, the good things that's been done to us or the bad things that's been done to us, like that core of us, that we can have a moment of clarity in that center with God together, that you could know that you are just deeply, intimately loved, and that you are not defined by any of those peripheral things. Those things don't have to define you. Those things don't have to run your life. Those things don't have to dictate who you are. They don't even dictate who you've been. You've always been defined by the love of God. And you always will be. Man, that we can just have a moment of clarity to sit in that reality together and to grow into our ability to live that identity out, to bring that identity out of the church building and into our daily lives. That's what I want for us this morning. Take a moment, if you will, if you can. Close your eyes and try to conjure up a memory of one of the most profound, meaningful, positive moments of your life. And I didn't say one of the most fun or exciting times of your life. Not just the coolest vacation you've ever been on, or when you really nailed that dance in the center of the dance floor and everybody cheered your name. But like a real, actual, profound, meaningful, positive memory. Maybe a moment you spent with a friend, a wedding day, birth of a child, the day you accepted Christ, you graduated or accomplished something important to you, your first 30 days clean. Take a moment, find a moment like that, just one, and meditate on it. Relive that moment just a bit. I'll give you a handful of seconds to do that. Now, I bet you, if we, weren't ex-Baptists and we could bet, take odds and all that stuff. If I was a betting man, I would bet that the vast majority of us experienced that moment, whatever that moment was. I bet most of us, the vast majority of us, experienced that memory in terms of the people we shared that moment with. Even if it was a personal accomplishment, the meaningful moment is experienced as you shared that event with someone. Like maybe not, maybe it was just something that you did and you were really proud of yourself. But even then, I bet if you traced back, why are you proud? It's because of how you broke out of negative relationships with other people. And that was something that has to do with your relationship with God. Some way, some shape, some form, that moment was meaningful because of some kind of relationship. Because meaning in life is found in relationships. And here's the most important part. That was groundwork for our message this morning. Here's the important part right here. The groundwork is, we just laid a foundation that meaning in life is found in relationships. And here's the point of this morning. Relationship requires presence. When you look at the most profound, meaningful times in your life, it will be based on relationships. Relationships are the meaning of life. Relationships require presence. And presence isn't just a physical thing. We've all been physically present somewhere and not really there. Am I right? Relationships require presence like in a stillness of self. The ability to pay attention to the moment and the other person. To really be with someone. To really be with someone, you have to silence parts of yourself so you can actually attend to that person. For two people to be present to each other, they have to move beyond the distractions and the noise of the world. And when you experience that, it's almost a miraculous experience when you can sit with someone present and attentive to each other's insecurities and wounds and failures, but be there together. And it's in that honest, vulnerable place that we find real fellowship and real meaning. And that's why God's grace is so powerful, because it teaches us that God is always fully present to us like that. He never bypasses what we perceive as our failures. He never whitewashes our insecurities. He sits with us right in the midst of it all and reminds us of who we are in Him. As we learn to be present, to really be present to God and present to each other, we can grow in our experience of really being known, really knowing others to be loved and love in return. Relationships ask us to actually be with someone. And in today's world, it can be really hard to do that because of the hustle and bustle of life, because of all those distractions that we talked about when we first began. Lighthearted distractions. I can't think of the word I want to say, but lighthearted, like TV and podcasts and squirrels. Down to really profound distractions, like our deep-seated wounds and unhealthy habits and insecurities. The world is stupid noisy today. A seemingly infinite blare of distractions cry out at us, competing for our presence. Our computer screens want us to be present to them. Our smartphone screens want us to be present to them. Television screens, movie theater screens, billboards, podcasts, music, books, work, hobbies, the news, politics, housework, bills, screaming kids, and the seeming immediate needs of everybody around us who needs us right now. Even our own frantic minds can distract us, demanding our attention, pulling us away from being actually present where we are, telling us we have no time to slow down, no time for stillness, no time for presence, no time for silence, only the constant noise of all that we need to do and all the things that we're distracted by. And listen, that is exactly where the enemy wants us, lost, alone in the noise. But God's invitation is different. It's not an invitation to being alone in the noise. God's invitation is an invitation into presence through solitude. God invites us to be present, to create the space in our lives where we can actually hear His voice and the voices of those we love, to carve out silence in which we can connect in meaningful ways with others. As you think back on that profound moment that you chose to meditate on this morning, wasn't it meaningful because you were present to the moment? You were there with those people, with that time, with that event, maybe even present to God. The practice of solitude is the practice of presence. And maybe when you hear the word solitude, you might think of monks sitting on deserted mountaintops, totally alone and disconnected from others, people escaping from the presence of people, and so abandoning the joy and meaning of real practical life. But the practice of solitude that we're jumping in today, the spiritual practice of solitude, is not about escaping intimacy and getting alone. It's about finding the space to be present to God, to be present to yourself, to be present to others in true and meaningful ways. The practice of solitude is the practice of leaving the loneliness of noise behind and finding the intimacy of presence in a spiritual and psychological stillness with others. And this is how Jesus actually managed his time on earth. Check out this from Luke chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. Yet the news about Jesus spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. The word translated lonely is the word for wilderness. It can sometimes be a dangerous place. It's a place away from others. It's a place of spiritual testing. It's a place of spiritual recalibration. Jesus often withdrew from the hustle and bustle of people to have time alone to pray. And guys, no one was under more pressure to pay more attention to more noise than Jesus. Everybody was always looking for him. God became human one time in human history. He spent 30 years growing up, learning stuff, and working a blue-collar job, providing for his mom after his dad died. And then he had 3 years of public ministry as a human. 3 years to preach the kingdom of heaven to the world. 3 years to die on the cross, resurrect, and ascend to heaven. He had 3 years to save humanity. What have you done in the past 3 years? I've been at Grace Church for 7. 3 years is a pretty tight schedule for saving the world. Talk about pressure. So, since Jesus had so many people with so many needs to pay attention to and so many eternally important things to get done on a daily basis, what did he make sure he did often? Leave everything and everybody behind and practice solitude. He pushed pause, got alone, got still, silenced the noise, and reconnected with God and his purpose and his identity. He practiced being present to the moment, to his Father, to himself, to those around him. Part of that practice of presence was retreating in solitude. Here's another example. Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 30. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. And then what did he do? Go ahead. Very early in the next morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Go ahead. Yeah, Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. Everyone is looking for you right here, right now. Let's go somewhere else. Jesus went alone, away from the perceived needs, away from everybody else's ideas about who he should be and what he should be doing. All the calls from all the crowds and all the immediate needs, he went away from that, recalibrated in the presence of his Father, and said, "We're going somewhere else." He recalibrated who he was in the presence of his Father, and that changed what he was going to do for the coming days. When he found himself present with people once again, he was able to be present with them as himself in the presence of his Father, as opposed to only being present to their expectations and their perceived needs and their definitions of him and his ministry that weren't actually aligned with his Father's will. This is something I don't do well. Most of the things I preach, I'm perfect at. I wouldn't preach them if I wasn't perfect at them. Just ask my wife. Oh, she's not here. Good. Oh, she's here. Never mind. Don't ask her. But this is a really, really hard one for me. It's something I believe in deeply, and it's like, in Romans chapter 7, the things that I want to do, those are the very things I don't do. I don't know why. I know there's a deeper, richer experience of life for me being centered in the presence of God and receiving my identity from him. And I step out of the church building, out of my office, and I immediately start finding my identity in the needs I'm meeting for other people, or how much I'm accomplishing, or whatever other religious standards I've learned to place on myself. And I'm winning or I'm losing in life instead of being present to the moment with myself, with God, and with others. Yeah. I'm more like Peter. I like to call Peter sometimes, I like to call him Peter Piper. Not because he made pizza, but because Peter was always piping up. Whenever he wasn't supposed to say something, he had something to say. The problem with having a life divorced from the practice of solitude is that you often stay quiet when it's time to speak up, and you often speak up when it's time to be quiet because you weren't really present to yourself in the presence of God. You haven't learned to sit in the moment, aware of your impulses to be distracted. Instead, you're present to the expectations of the world and governed by the impulses of your hurts, habits, and hang-ups. You often pipe up when you should keep quiet and stay quiet when you should pipe up. Here's an example of Peter not being silent and present in the moment. Go ahead. Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 2. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. I love that passage. That last part in parentheses, it's actually in the Bible. That's actually Scripture. Mark tells us, and remember, Mark, traditionally, what we understand about the book of Mark is that Mark wrote down the gospel of Jesus as he heard it from Peter. So I imagine Peter telling Mark, then I said, yeah, let's build 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. I didn't know what to say. I was just freaked out. And like, if Mark was a good friend, I wonder if Mark would say, but Peter, if you didn't know what to say, why'd you say something? Peter just was not present to the moment. He was only present to his own uncomfortableness and of being afraid and not knowing what to say in the moment. And so maybe he felt like he had to say something to insert himself into this conversation that was going on between Jesus and Moses and Elijah, like these post-mortem saints that were somehow alive now with Jesus. And Peter's like, well, I should probably say something. like how unaware he was of the moment and what was going on. He was only present to his own insecurities, his own discomfort, his impulses to be defined by the world. And so Peter piped up. He was just too consumed with the noise of his own frantic need to be relevant in the moment. And there's lots of, I'm not going to go over what did he mean when he said, let's build shelters. What was he actually saying? The point that's a fun discussion, but the point of it all is Peter's misunderstanding in the moment. His failure in the moment, if you want to call it that, wasn't his lack of understanding the moment. His failure was his inability to actually just be present to the moment and to the people he was with. He was only present to his own inner world. Here's how God responded to Peter's piping. Go ahead to our next slide. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. 2 things from this, and this is not necessarily what the Scripture is teaching, but this is a lesson that I received from this passage of Scripture, is when we're not present to the moment will pass us by. Peter wasn't present to the moment, and suddenly that moment of transfiguration in the presence of transfigured Jesus and Elijah and Moses, suddenly it was just gone. When you're not present to the moment will pass you by. Secondly, notice what God did. Whenever Peter was distracted by his own perceived ideas of what the moment needed to be, God covered the moment in a cloud, covered up all the distractions, made Peter get alone with himself, away from all of his senses that he was trying to figure everything out with and pipe up about. He covered the place with the cloud and spoke very, very clearly, focus on Jesus. Get alone in your inner self with Jesus, not alone with your inner self and your insecurities or your need to be relevant or whatever it was that was making Peter pipe up. They looked around and suddenly there was no one but Jesus. I think that's kind of the point of practicing solitude, to step out of the fog of the world's noise and find ourselves present to Jesus in whatever moment we're in. Go ahead to our last slide there. The practice of solitude is basically the practice of silence. That too, but the practice of presence, which is funny. I kind of wanted to highlight the practice of solitude, of going away, is actually the practice of being here. You have to go away and practice being alone with God to recalibrate who you really are, who God really is, what life's really about. You have to practice that so that you can actually be present with other people in a healthy, shalom type way. The practice of solitude is the practice of being here, the practice of presence. And like any practice, any skill, it's something that you train in. You do, and you're not great at it at first, and then you get better. We just finished talking about the spiritual practice of fasting. I hope that you and I won't just stop the practice now that we've done it for 4 weeks. Like fasting, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. Like this is, if you're like me, it wasn't easy. at least half the time, I didn't really get anything from it but being hungry. But if I stick with it, I might actually get better at it, because that's how practices work. And so the practice of solitude is going to take practice, and many of us aren't going to be good at it when we first start. But that's just how practices work. Remember, you are practicing something. I know I've done this so many times, and I'm sorry for repeating myself and saying the same thing twice, and like saying one thing and then saying the thing again and repeating myself. But take your age and divide it in half. A little bit of math this morning, I get it. Divide your age in half and think about the person you were at that age, your half-life person. What was important to you? What were your habits? What were your aspirations? What were your dreams? How did you treat other people? How did you expect people to treat you? That half-life you was you. It wasn't anybody else. But I bet if I were to go and talk to half-life you and then talk to you, in many important ways, it would almost be like talking to a different person. Because you're not just somebody, you are becoming somebody. You have a set of practices, ways that you habitually think, ways you habitually act, things you do, things you believe, and your habits of belief and thought and action, they are making you somebody. What we're talking about this whole year at Grace Church is specific practices that Jesus did that we can do so that we can make sure that to the best of our ability, we are becoming like Jesus. These practices are things that we can do that position us before God for Him to do the things in us that we can't do. The practices are things we can do to present ourselves before God for what He can do. So the practice of solitude is going to be something intentional for all of us, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. Being alone intentionally, practicing solitude, is not the same as an introvert. I can go be alone and be comfortable, but not practicing solitude. I can escape without being present. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said something like this. He said, beware, I'm going to go totally butcher this. This is the Nick Acker paraphrase message voice translation of what Bonhoeffer said. Something to the effect of, if you can't be alone, beware. If you can't be around others, beware. If you're always having to be with other people or you're always having to be alone, there's something broken with you. I'm saying always. Some people are introverts and are alone more. Some people are extroverts and like to be with people more. But the idea is, Bonhoeffer says basically, if you can only always be alone, you're going to be enslaved by your own inner world and your own ego, and you're going to spiral into a prison of self. But if you can only always be with other people, then you're going to be trapped by the opinions and the expectations of other people, and you will be enslaved and spiral into a prison of the community, the others. We need to be able to practice both. To be safely alone, we need to be with other people so we don't spiral in our own deceptions and whatever. And we need to be able to retreat in solitude and be alone with God so that we can be with others in a healthy way, not as leeches or domineering people. Solitude is a practice that's worth practicing because you are becoming someone, and we all want to become like Jesus. Yeah. So here's what we're going to do. I have more notes that we could talk about. You know, the little 5.5 inch by 2.5 inch new appendage. Did you know that the human body now has a new appendage? Yeah, it's just in the past few years. Your new appendage. It's always within reach. Most of us, we wake up in the morning, it's the first appendage we reach for. Can't go anywhere without it. How many times do we reach for it? I mean, we are never alone anymore. We're always just one notification away, one text away, always away from the next notification of a like or a text needing help or a phone call. We're never alone anymore. It's something that more than ever we have to practice. Noise is a new appendage for us, a 5.5 by 2.5 extension of ourselves, connecting us to the tiny world of our phone. When we were doing the practice, I think it was just the introductory thing that we did at practicingtheway.org, and there was one guy's testimony. He said that he found himself waking up every morning, and the first thing he did was look at his phone, check his emails, his notifications, or whatever, and he immediately found himself suddenly a big part of a small world. Everybody needs him. You know, he's looking at the news, and he's looking down on this small world, a big part of a small world, and that was his first emotional thought every morning. So what he started doing instead is he wouldn't look at his phone until he went outside, and he'd spend the first 5 minutes outside, remembering that he's not a big part of a small world, but he's a small part in God's big world, and reorienting himself to reality apart from that new appendage. So that's what I'm inviting us to this morning, is to take a look at our lives. How are we doing at being present in the moment to God and to people around us? What are some practices that you what are some habits that you can start addressing? For instance, if someone is talking to you, do you usually find yourself present to them, listening to their voice, or do you find yourself waiting for them to stop talking so you can say what you've formulated to reply with? Is that just me? Just me? Maybe. Or when you're doing something, do you find yourself present with the thing that you're doing, or do you sometimes find yourself feeling anxious about the other things that you're not doing? Little things that we can notice about ourselves of how sometimes we're struggling to be present in the moment, and we can see those things and start practicing being present in those moments. And so a lot of that is going to be specific to you, but here's what we're going to do together to practice solitude, is spend the first moments of your day in solitude in God's presence. Don't be sorry. The absence of that kind of noise is the sound of a dying church. So thank you for that. What we're going to do to practice together, and you heard what I said first. There's some practices that you can start being aware of different ways. I gave you just those two examples, but different ways of maybe where the lack of presence affects you in your daily life. And that's going to be specific to you, for you to pay attention. How do I find myself not present in relationships, in conversations, in my daily activities at work or whatever? And you can start seeing those things and practicing being present to that moment. Take a breath. Breathe. Trust God with what's coming afterwards and be in the moment. And to help us practice that in kind of an ongoing specific way, this first week's communal practice for us to do together is to spend the first moments of your day in solitude in God's presence. And like anything, man, if you can't, the idea is to do this every day. Is when you wake up in the morning, let your first moments, give the first fruits of your time to God. To let your relationship with God, your identity in Him, be the thing that starts off the definitive moments of your day. And so the idea is that you try to find a quiet place. Maybe go outside like that other guy talked about. Find yourself a small part of God's big world. And take a few deep breaths. Breathe. I love when I do like solitude or meditation, breathing. I love to breathe in and imagine that as God's presence coming down to the earth. And as I breathe out, I experience that as me, like stepping into that outpouring of God's presence. Is it this flow of God moving to me and me moving to God in this really fun relational kind of way. But take a few moments and breathe. Let yourself be in the moment where you are in that place of quiet, and leaving your phone behind, right? Getting in that quiet place, breathing. And then the idea here, guys, is not, don't open your Bible. I mean, reading the Bible is crazy important. But the point here is to step out of the noise of the world. And even if you're reading a devotional, the devotional that you're reading, or if you have a devotion that you listen to, there's a great devotional you can listen to called Lectio 365. Fantastic. Download that app and listen to it all the time. But in these moments, the idea is to step out of the noise, because even a book is somebody's voice in your head. Even those positive voices can be crutches for us who don't know how to be quiet in the presence of God. And so the idea, if you need something to think about that you're sitting there in silence, looking at God as He looks at you in love. He's not looking at you in disappointment. He's not looking at you in expectation. You need to do good things for me today. He's not looking at you with any of those things. Look at God looking at you in love, acceptance, nothing but peace and pleasure in you. And have some time in silence alone with God, recalibrating your being to who you are, which is loved by God. And then spend a moment thinking about how you can carry that moment into your day. And then step into your day. You might even decide to microdose solitude in your day, doing something like this throughout the day. Maybe the last 5 minutes of your lunch break, or take a 5-minute break at work if you can, and go and microdose this, recalibrating, like you take a wrong turn on your GPS, recalibrate your position with yourself, with God, and go back and step into whatever moment you're in and be present there to God and to the moment. So, before I pray, let me just say this. May we be like Jesus, who often retreated to places of solitude so that He could actually be present with people in the presence of His Father. Let's pray.